Our first presentation for this morning is GintasKmaitis. He is the aquaculture consultant from Campbellville. Gintas has degrees in fisheries, biology, and biological engineering. He has 30 years of experience in aquaculture, wastewater treatment, and environmental management. He focuses in aquaculture, specifically facility design, operation and business planning, nutrient management, wastewater treatment, and ecological engineering. He also has extensive experience with the issues of nutrient enrichment and aquatic productivity, and preparing, receiving water impact and assimilative capacity studies. Well, you know what? He can say this much better than I can, so I'm just going to let him carry on.
Yeah, it's just a fancy way of saying I'm a bit of a jack of all trades, but anyway. I'm here to speak to you about aquaculture, but more specifically, the study that we've done looking at what the opportunity is here. And this presentation was prepared as a generic presentation, so I'll go through some of the slides rather quickly because this is all information you all know probably better than I do. So I will not dwell on what you would already know. What I'll try to do is spend a bit more time on the aspects of the aquaculture industry and the study we've done, so that would be unique information to you or different information. I also encourage you to stop me midway anytime and ask a question. If you have a question you want to ask, please go ahead and ask. It doesn't bother me at all to stop and to address things, because I think sometimes it's better if we can ask things as they occur to us rather than wait till the end. So feel free to put up your hand and I'll try to see if anybody has a question, and then I'll try to address it at the same time. So we might as well start off, first of all, with the first slide. The next one, please. Yeah, this is all information that you know. It's all background information on the community, on what your population is. This is more just sort of background for whoever's seeing this presentation, particularly people that may be potential partners in a venture. Yeah, actually that'd be much better for me. Oh, that's great. I love that. Okay, next slide, please. Oh, no, we missed one. Oh, no, was it there? Okay, that's it. Yeah. Sorry, I'm the one that's disoriented here. So we were looking at the opportunity here, and what's really evident is that you've got so much shoreline. It's just amazing how much shoreline you have around this nation. It's probably one of your greatest resources, and yet it's a resource that is often ignored. With this amount of shoreline, you have 220 kilometers of shoreline, and that could potentially be used for aquaculture. So this is what first piqued everyone's interest is, and plus you do have a very viable and a very well-run fish farm here already at Buzzwalk. Ben Knosway's operation is probably one of the better operations in the province. It's quite an impressive operation. If we were to take a look at aquaculture production in Ontario, that's the sort of graph we see up to 2016. What's really interesting is that the red there is rainbow trout, and the blue are all other species other than rainbow trout. So what you can see is that the dominant species that's grown in Ontario is rainbow trout. In fact, we know for a fact, because of the regulatory restrictions, all rainbow trout you see in the store are farmed. You cannot fish rainbow trout commercially and sell them in a store. So all rainbow trout in the province are farmed. The other thing is there's a lot of, the blue part of it is small, but it's growing. There's a lot of interest in developing other species. But the technology for growing other species sometimes is a bit more complex than it is for rainbow trout. The other thing that's very important to recognize is rainbow trout have been cultured in the province for over 100 years in one form or another. So they're highly domesticated. They are a fish that has been adapted to the farm environment. So they are less prone to disease, they tend to grow more evenly. There's a lot of really good characteristics about rainbow trout that make them very attractive for farming. And the fact that you can handle them without causing diseases or other problems. Next slide, please. If you take a look at aquaculture in Ontario, yes, question?
What's the general health of fish in Ontario?
From the wild fish or for the domestic fish?
Oh,
Both, okay. Health of the fish itself or the health of the fishery?
the fish.
The fish. From my perspective, the health of the fish, from what I can see, is quite good, especially in a farm environment. The health of fish is generally very good in a farmed environment. I think the health of wild fish is good too, but the one issue that concerns me is contaminants in the environment. That's a big issue. And that is all purely through the food chain. Right? Like fish will absorb some contaminants for the water, but usually most contaminants come through the food chain. And there are areas where it is a big problem, whether it's mercury, whether it's PCBs, and generally it's the fattier the fish and the bigger the fish, the more accentuated the problem. So yeah, I would not say that we have a blanket clean bill of health for the wild fisheries. There are hot spots where there are contaminants that we have to watch consumption. And
Also, the other thing, I'd like to know, what is in the food that are fed to the fish that are farmed?
oh yeah, the diets tend to change over time as our knowledge improves. In the past, they were primarily fish meal and fish oil. That was large part of the diet. With time, we've been shifting away from that, using as much fish meal and fish oil, and using other products like agricultural byproducts. They put things in like poultry meal, just to basically extend the diets and use less wild fish in the diet. But the primary concern with fish diets is to make sure it meets the nutritional needs of the fish. So in the past, research was all geared towards finding out what those needs are. Now, that's not the case now. We pretty well know what their nutritional needs are. It's trying to find the best ingredients at a reasonable cost to meet those requirements. And that's where a lot of the emphasis is in the fish diet. So fish diets are very expensive. A kilo of fish food's over $2 per kilo. So it's a very expensive input, and that's why there's so much emphasis on diets. Yes?
The fish farms, are they all genetically engineered then? Like, a lot of people probably don't know what diploid means and things like that.
The fish genetically engineered?
Yes.
No, they're not. There's nobody in Ontario that grows a genetically engineered fish.
But they're not, aren't they don't, like, if they're free, they don't go and have other fish, like, they don't crossbreed with the wild fish, do they?
Well, that's, it certainly, it can happen in the wild. And if you, like, for example, there's a farm I know very well, we're in a gravel pit, where we're growing rainbow trout in a gravel pit to help rehabilitate the pit. Any fish that get out, they'll reproduce. They're reproducing in the wild. Like in that lake,
So
they're reproducing on their own.
Anymore?
Pardon me?
They're not diploids and triploids anymore?
There are some triploids people are using, but the triploids won't reproduce. And most fish are diploid. By the way, just about every fish normally is a diploid. The only other thing that some farmers do is they grow all female fish. And those are not genetically engineered. That is purely a situation where early in the life stage they feed hormone to the fish, that's the brood fish, and then after that they take eggs from that and then their progeny, it turns out all female. But there's no like gene splicing or anything like that going on. Not at all. In fact, the Canadian aquaculture industry has come out against genetically modified fish. It's a policy statement of theirs. They do not support it in the industry. Yes?
I eat a lot of fish. I buy $100 worth of fish a month. So last month you brought 6 trout, 6 trout, 2 pickerel, and one pike. And I just missed out on a sturgeon. they already got rid of the sturgeon. I didn't notice any difference between the taste of the fish that Buzzlaw fisheries or the fish that's wild. I didn't notice no difference.
Where does the wild fish come from?
Around towards Rabbit Island, around that
Yeah.
Virgin Bay area, I guess.
Yeah,
Pretty sure that's where he fishes the.
right.
And I didn't notice. And then he said the sturgeon. He said M&R might have told him that they might be going extinct. The big sturgeon.
Yeah.
Do you know anything about that?
Yeah, they've had issues with recruitment, with young fish coming into the population. There's reproductive issues, like it's got to do with environmental quality and reproduction. But I think what we should do is probably get back on the topic of the
Okay.
fish farm. And if you have other questions, I'm around all day, so you'll be able to talk to me about that. Getting back to this slide. This is where the most fish farms are in the province. The green up at the top, that's the net pens, the cage farms. That's like Buzzlaw fisheries, growing fish in a net pen in the open water. The blue area are land-based farms. These are farms that are on a stream, or using well water, and they generally have to pump that water. And the fish are contained in a tank or a raceway, which is a long trough. What has happened is that an industry started in that lower area. That's where the aquaculture industry started in Ontario in the 60s. In the 80s, there was a move by some pioneering fish farmers to start putting net pens out in Georgian Bay, and that started to grow. It was actually very, very successful. What happened in southern Ontario is because everybody knows how popular bottled water is. When fish farms would get into any kind of financial trouble, or even if there was a transition where a farmer would retire and want to get out of the business, bottling companies were frequently buying up these farms for the water, not for the fish, because they can make a lot more money bottling water than they could growing fish in it. So what happened is that the industry in southern Ontario started to shrink as the industry in northern Ontario started to grow. But the one thing that makes the industry in southern Ontario very important to the north is that's where all your fingerlings come from. That's where all your seed stock comes from for the north to grow fish. And that's because the waters in southern Ontario are very well suited to growing fingerling trout. The water chemistry, the water quality is very amenable to growing fingerlings. So what's happened is a lot of the farms in southern Ontario transitioned from growing market-sized fish to growing fingerlings for stocking cages. So that's generally how the industry operates now. Next slide, please. Net pens are pretty well exclusively used in northern Ontario. There are no net pen operations in southern Ontario, primarily because of user conflict. That's the plain and simple thing is a lot of cottagers just don't want to see a fish cage off their cottage. For them, it's not something they want. And so what you have is all the industries here up in the north in terms of the net pens, the open pens, and there's nothing in the south. Next slide, please. Temperature is one of the most important things about fish farming. We know fish is a cold-blooded animal, and because of that, its growth, its metabolism, everything about it is tied to water temperature. Its immune system is tied to the water temperature. And so there is a real emphasis on finding water that's ideally suited to rainbow trout. And that, from the perspective of temperature, that it's a very critical thing. Trout have an optimum for growth that's around 18 degrees Celsius. They have probably an optimum for overall health and well-being that's a bit lower than that, probably around 17, 16 degrees. And anything beyond 18 degrees, you're going to start getting a decrease in growth and an increase in stress. So trout will become stressed once the temperature gets above 20 degrees. So that's something that's very important to consider when you're looking at where to fish farm. Because if the temperatures go consistently over 20 degrees in the summer, that makes it more difficult, induces some stresses, and it can be a problem in the long term. Next slide, please. This is what trout growth looks like compared to over temperature. So in the wintertime, they grow very little, and as they grow bigger, and as the temperatures go up, they start to grow much, much faster. And you can see after about 17, 18 degrees, the growth drops off very rapidly. And in fact, once you get close to 24, 25 degrees, if that line was continued, the fish would be losing weight. They'd be shrinking because they can't consume the feed and they have to use their own energy to maintain themselves. What we found that's really interesting in the work we've done is that in that bottom section where it shows no growth, if you put them in a current, like a raceway, and actually have them active and moving, they will actually grow at those temperatures. And this has been just a recent discovery we've had. So it's also tied to its metabolic, and not just the temperature, but it's also its activity. If a fish is a bit more active and actively swimming, it will tend to, its metabolism will also be active as well. Next slide. Because of the potential that exists here to grow fish, I was retained to come here and do a shoreline capacity study to look at what is the potential for growing fish in the coastal areas, shoreline areas around here. And at that time, I just focused basically on this immediate area. I didn't look at the island as a whole. But one thing that's very important, in addition to water temperature, is water depth. As you know, when you feed fish, they produce manure, and that manure, if there isn't a sufficient current, will go to the bottom under the cage. So it's very, very important to have sufficient depth underneath the cage so there's good flushing. That manure is actually, if it's dispersed, is actually a resource for the ecosystem. The only time it becomes a problem is if it accumulates underneath and is not allowed to pile up. And we've had some really excellent examples in the province of where fish farms have actually improved the fishery in a lake. In fact, there was a very long-term study that was done where they actually had two lakes, one with the fish cage in it, one without, almost identical lakes. And the one with the cage almost doubled the lake trout fishery, the whitefish fishery, and the sucker populations in that lake, just from a cage of fish being in that lake. And as soon as they stopped the operation, because it was an experiment, the populations declined back to previous levels. So we have very, very strong evidence to show that fish farms actually enhance the wild fishery. And in the past, people would say, well, gee, it's a real negative to the environment. It's actually not. In a lake environment like you have here, where nutrients are limited, especially in the deeper waters, it's a very positive thing to have that nutrient input. And we're seeing the direct physical evidence now. One of the best lake trout fisheries in Georgian Bay is right next to a fish farm in Parry Sound. The fish farm has been there since 1984. And the population of lake trout has been consistently getting better and better and better. It was in serious trouble in the 80s. So the ideal depth for a cage has to be at least 15 meters deep. Deeper is better, but you need at least 15 meters of water. The other thing that's very important is that the lakes, depending on the shoreline or environment, the waters can stratify here, thermally stratified in the summer. And in the summer you have a warm water layer and a deep water layer. If you locate a net pen where fish cannot access the deep water, you can have serious problems because of the temperature preference of the trout. If they can get deep and into the cool water, they'll be okay. They can even come up to the surface and feed in the warm water and then go back down. But they cannot be kept in that service area for a sustained period of time without having some problems. Next slide, please. In looking for where there may be some good areas for locating a fish farm here, I used a number of tools. First of all, we looked at the navigation charts. We also looked directly at certain stretches of shoreline to see if it would be suitable. The other thing, there's a really good database of Great Lakes data that basically is online, and you can query any location out in the lakes and get a pretty good profile at any time of year, at pretty well any water depth, of what the temperatures will be like, what the currents are like, and what the winds are like. So you can get a pretty good handle on conditions out there at various times. The other thing is that we had a lot of territory to cover, so it's very important to filter the information. And so one of the most effective ways of filtering it was to actually use the temperature and the shoreline as a criteria, the shoreline depth and exposure. So when we were looking for good locations, we were looking at locations that are not very exposed to wind and waves, because that can be very hard on a cage. The other thing we were looking at, that you get deep enough that you can have a fish cage, and that it also would have suitable temperatures. Next slide. So when we looked at water depth, well, this is basically the kind of map we came up with, and that is the red areas are areas that are too shallow to have a fish cage. There just isn't any way you should be locating a fish cage in those red areas. So that it tells you that there's a fair bit of shoreline that would be too shallow for a fish farm. And the consequence of that would be you'd either have to locate the cages far offshore, or you would not get sufficient current to disperse the fish manure underneath the cages, which would be a real issue environmentally. Next slide, please. When we looked at exposure, which sites are very exposed to wind and waves, that's the blue there. Very exposed sites. Cages wouldn't last very long there, just because of the ice action in the spring. And I know Ben is using sinking cages in the spring to avoid ice, and that's a really good technology. Most fish farms are using the sinking cages in Ontario. They are sunk for about a week or two while the ice goes out. And that's very good in locations that are relatively sheltered, that where you have shorelines where the winds pile up ice, 10, 20, 30 feet deep. That sinking cage isn't going to help very much, because the ice will be piled up in through the water as well, and you can't sink them deep enough to get away from that ice. So those blue areas are far too exposed to have a fish farm. Now, if we go to the next slide, we put both together, and you can see the areas that could accommodate a fish farm along the shoreline. So there's I'll just point it out here. There's a very small stretch here that's relatively protected, but it's a very small area, and it has good deep water. But you take a look, pretty well the only place that would be recommended would be actually not very far from where Buzzsaw Fisheries is right now, in Manitowoc Bay, along that shoreline there, and in South Bay. Now the issue with South Bay is it's got a fairly small opening relative to the rest of the water body, and it's shallow to the open waters of the lake. So there is no real opportunity for the water to exchange in the summer months. At least the deep waters will not exchange. So if you put a fish farm in there and start feeding heavily, you can very easily get get enough nutrient into that area that in the summertime you may overload it, and in the winter have problems with oxygen levels. The other location, Buzzsaw, where Buzzsaw is up along that shoreline, generally there's a restriction on how close fish farms can be to each other. And on the east and west coast, they use 5 kilometers as the minimum separation distance between fish farms. And this is mostly to make sure that the environmental impact of one farm does not affect the other, and also fish health. You do not want to have unhealthy fish from one farm potentially transferring disease to another. And fortunately, we don't really have a lot of problems like that. But still, just for sake of precaution, it's never a good idea to put 2 farms together. So there's a very limited opportunity there because of the proximity to Buzzsaw Fisheries. So then what does this tell us? Despite the long length of shoreline, There's very few sites that would be suitable for aquaculture. Yet you're surrounded by water everywhere. So, you know, what's the solution? So this just summarizes some of the locations where we could have aquaculture. You can go on to the next slide, please. One thing that's very interesting about the Great Lakes is there was a report that was prepared a few years ago called Feast and Famine. And because of the new species that have come into the Great Lakes, there's a situation where in the near-shore areas of the lakes where there's urbanization or agriculture or other nutrient input, there's too much nutrient in the water. But in the deep areas of the lake, the deep water areas where you have lake trout, whitefish, all these fish, cold water species that depend on the deep waters, there's literally a famine. There just isn't enough nutrient out there because all these other things like the zebra mussels soak up the nutrient, and there's none available or very little available to feed the natural food chain. Next slide. What this means is that there's a really good opportunity for aquaculture offshore in the deeper waters, because aquaculture does bring the nutrients that would help feed that aquatic ecosystem. And at the same time, it creates a situation where you can add a fair bit of nutrient to the water and have actually a positive effect rather than a negative effect. The last thing you want to do is locate a fish farm where additional nutrients would be a problem. You want to put a fish farm where the nutrients will be of benefit. So that tells us that offshore aquaculture, not on the shoreline, but offshore, is probably a good solution to the problem. Next slide. We can skip that. That was the study about the lake trout and cage farm in the experimental lakes, where they had the two lakes side by side. And I know we don't have a lot of time, so I'll skip over that. The answer may be to go offshore. To go offshore requires a whole different approach to cages or net pens. The big problem we have out in open water is if you look at the wave data off the eastern shore of the island, you have waves that are over 6 meters high at some times. 6 meters, like that there's no cage out there that I know of that could withstand that kind of pounding. So the solution may be to look at a cage design that can be sunk and can go below the action of the waves in more calm waters. And there's a cage design called StormSafe, and they're trialing it. It has a lot of potential. There are some issues with it. They have to work out the bugs of it first. But it was developed by a Manitoulin fish farmer, Mike Meeker, and he has been using these. He's actually been in the business since the 80s, and he's had a lot of experience with ice and ice damage. And this cage system has some significant potential for offshore. What makes it unique is the design. It's very, very rugged, and you can see that the actual cage frame encompasses the whole cage. And instead of having floating docks on top, it has vertical spars that go straight up and down and have 3 different chambers for controlling buoyancy. So what you have is a very rigid frame that can be at the water surface or could be submerged. And it only takes about 2 minutes to submerge this cage. All you have to do is open a valve and the whole cage system sinks down below the waves. So this is basically a diagram that illustrates what happens with waves and depth. When you have waves out in open water, the motion of the wave tends to be circular. And you can see as you go deeper, the energy goes down. The circle gets smaller and smaller and smaller. So by going deep, you can avoid most of the energy. The other thing is if you're close to shore, because the bottom of the lake is pushing up, it tends to flatten that circle. So that means you have a lot of horizontal motion, and that's what's really, really hard on something sitting on the surface, is that back and forth motion. That's a lot more destructive than just straight up and down. So by being able to sink the cages, you can take the cages down to where the energy level is lower, but also by going a little deep, you can then avoid that horizontal motion back and forth. Next slide, please. Is that it? Okay, I don't think we have too many more, do we? No, okay. So after we completed the shoreline capacity study, the question was, what are the next steps? Well, the first step after that was a feasibility study. We were looking, is it practical and economical to use this type of cage to grow fish offshore? Now, clearly, the thing that has to be understood here is that the only way this could happen is if there was approval by chief and council. One thing I neglected to mention is that in the last 5 years, the aquaculture industry has grown about 12% a year in the province. Up till then, it stagnated. That graph you saw there, 15 years of just straight stagnation. In fact, production was dropping. What was the difference? The government regulations haven't changed very much, because that's the main reason they were being held up. What has changed is the involvement of First Nations in aquaculture. Virtually every new farm or all new production coming online was either done directly by an Aboriginal entrepreneur or private company or private individual who's had an agreement with the First Nation and had a license issued by chief and council. Not a single Aboriginal aquaculture project has had a permit issued by the Ministry of Natural Resources. Every single one has got their permit through chief and council. And generally what these permits look like, they're very similar to provincial permits, where there's monitoring requirements, there's water quality monitoring, fish health monitoring. What's the main difference is that the authority comes through the First Nation, and it's usually a much clearer line of permitting than you get with the government, because the government has so many different ministries, so many different agencies, and then on top, there is a need for a First Nation to approve anyway. So fish farmers have basically said, look, we'll either help other fish farmers on First Nations communities get started, or we'll work with them and start our own farm with them. And so that's what's happened. So there's been massive growth in the industry in the last 5 years because of that. So then what we did is we looked at the feasibility. It looks like very technically feasible. The next step was to do a business plan. Does this hang together as a business case? The one thing that makes this quite different than most other businesses that would be on that you would be looking at is the scale of operation has to be a lot larger to be offshore. You have to have a large boat. You have to have infrastructure. You have to have mechanized feeding. There's a lot of things that are required if you want to go offshore. But we did the business plan, just completed it. It looks very, very attractive. It seems like there would be a really good opportunity here to start an aquaculture business that would involve the community. It would pretty well have to be done on a community scale. The next step would be, because not everybody knows how to grow fish in that kind of environment, is to find a suitable partner. And by suitable partner, not just somebody who has money to invest, but somebody who has knowledge of the industry, has commitment, and it would be committed to work with the community and build capacity here to grow fish. So that's the next stage of where we're at. And that's to identify a knowledgeable and able business partner. And we do have one lined up right now, potentially, and there are others in the wings as well. And so the focus of the project now will be on that, finding suitable arrangements that are acceptable to the community and acceptable to the business partner. Next slide, please. This is just a quick summary of the financial projections we did. We were looking at using two different harvest strategies, a single harvest of large fish or a dual harvest of small fish and large fish. This would be for a 1-year production cycle. and a scale of business that would be commercially viable. So it's actually very attractive. You'd be looking at generating between 4,500 tons to 6,100 tons of fish, and annual sales of anywhere from 26 million to 34.8 million. And if you look at the profit, annual profit at full capacity, it basically is extremely attractive, particularly when you take a look at the initial investment that's required. You could be generating an annual profit that pretty well equals or exceeds the initial investment you had to put into the business, or the business partner had to put into the business. So it's extremely attractive financially. And that's it. Thank you very much for your attention. If you have any other questions, please ask me. I kind of glossed through it very quickly. There's a lot to know about the industry and what's going on. But most importantly, I'm here all day, so feel free to use me as a resource.
Is there only one buyer for fish in Ontario?
There's several. But right now, I'd say you're not too far off the mark, because about 70% of the fish that are grown in Ontario go through one particular processing plant in St. Thomas, but Cole Munro. And there's cold water fisheries in Little Current that also processes fish. And I think Purvis has processed fish on the other end of Manitoulin Island. This is what I'm talking about, rainbow trout. But generally, the fish farm, there's another fish processor, Olmsted, John O, in Leamington, that processes fish as well, or rainbow trout.
So sometimes, aren't some of the fish farms, have to sit on their product for a while when cold water decides, or cold mineral decides, oh, I'm not gonna take any fish?
Yeah, that can happen, yeah. And that's usually because there are some fish farmers that don't schedule their production very well. And what Cole Munro does, and I know Jeff Cole runs Cole Munro, I've worked with him, I've sold fish to him and that. If you project your production accurately, he will work with you. He'll work out a schedule to sell your fish, and that's acceptable to you. But if you're kind of on the spot market and you're growing them and you're trying to get the best price for them, then you could be caught with those fish. The other thing that happens is, I know one case when there's been farms that have been badly sited, like they're in a bad location, the temperatures get very high and they have to sell their fish right away. Well, then it can be a problem to move fish, because other people are trying to do the same. Yes?
Asian carp have been invading great fish.
I'm sorry?
Asian carp have been invading great fish.
Yes.
So if we were to invest in these fish feeds, would Asian carp have an impact on us in, say, 10 years?
No direct impact. No, they would have a terrible impact on the ecosystem and the fishery, but in an aquaculture situation, no, because they're isolated one from the other.
I got a question. We're a whitefish community. We like to enjoy whitefish. What's the possibility of us investing in whitefish operations for aquaculture?
Yes, there is. There's good opportunity. I think one thing about whitefish is that, and it's a challenge, because I've grown whitefish in the 80s even. They're still a developing species. They have huge potential, I think, but they're still a developing species. The technology, it's more that our knowledge of how to grow them and how to manage them isn't yet where it is with rainbow trout. And for that reason, like for instance, if you were as an entrepreneur were willing to start something up, I think that would not be a bad idea at all.
We have First Nation person investing in whitefish aquaculture at College Boreal. I think we should support that person
Right.
for investment to invest in this operation of whitefish aquaculture.
Right. Are they involved at all with the whitefish operation that's in Manitowoc Bay?
That remains to be seen.
Okay. I'm just curious. Yeah. But, whitefish has a lot of potential. I think it's a fish that's definitely on the horizon for aquaculture.
What kind of money is there available for investment in aquaculture?
It depends where you're looking. If you're looking at a commercial money, like for a venture, let's say, like we were talking about here, where you want a large investor that's capable, there's good money available for something that's proven and that they have confidence in. But for something that's a bit more developmental, like whitefish, you'd have to probably be looking at government money, government assistance. And there is government money out there. Like, there's no doubt, especially in a First Nations community. There are designated funds to support aquaculture in First Nation communities. So I think that there is money available. It doesn't come in as a big, huge pot of money. It's usually done on an annual basis. You have to put a business plan together or together, and they'll approve it ahead of time. But there's good money available.